It might sound odd, as we now know that North and South America contain some of the most magnificent natural wonders in the world. From the Andes Mountains up to the giant redwood forests, the Grand Canyon, Yosemite National Park, and many, many more. But it wasn't always this way. In 1785, the greatest natural historian in the world told Thomas Jefferson that the New World of America was a wasteland. So, what's going on here? Who are these two guys and why did this snub matter? Well, first of all, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a politician and a slave-owning plantation owner from America's South, and not yet a face carved into the side of a mountain. Jefferson was one of the founding fathers of the United States of America, the author of the Declaration of Independence, a future Secretary of State, Vice President, and President. At this point, he was helping to negotiate for the new USA with Great Britain, alongside his long-term frenemy, John Adams, and would soon switch over to France to take over from his other friend, Benjamin Franklin. Now remember that name, he's going to come back into the story later on, as Minister for France. Like many wealthy people of the age, mostly men because, well, the patriarchy, he had a fashionable interest in science, which meant he was keen to meet the famous scientific minds of the day while he was in Europe for work. Count Buffon, or to give him his full name, Georges Louis Leclerc Comte de Buffon, the guy who had authored the best known natural history books back then. A fine addition to any library that people would have loved to show off as the best summary of all known life, although he didn't manage to cover everything he had planned, for some reason stopping after animals, which in his view was just birds and quadrupeds, and minerals. Still, he did a better job than anyone else had, so people were pretty pleased. When Buffon, the world authority on natural history, told Thomas Jefferson that in the New World the sun was so weak and the climate so humid that animals and people shrunk, well, Jefferson didn't take it well. Serious scientists took Buffon's idea seriously. It was called the theory of American degeneracy. It wasn't just an insult to Jefferson, he saw it as a threat to the young nation's credibility. If America only produced small, weak creatures, how could it ever stand alongside the older nations of the day as an equal, let alone become the superpower we know from the last half of the 20th century? Jefferson couldn't let it slide. He didn't just want independence from Britain, he wanted a fossil war to prove that America was the equal of every other nation, and perhaps even a home to giants. Jefferson knew that his secret weapons were hidden in a little known location in what is now Kentucky, but was then part of a much larger colonial Virginia than the one we know today. He knew what was being unearthed across the US continent as white settlers and traders expanded west into Native American lands. At a place called Big Bone Lick, the things coming out of the ground had been a source of fascination for generations. Fossils were first found there by another Frenchman, Charles Lemont de Longueuil, Baron de Longueuil, as early as 1739, and sent, as coincidence would have it for our story, to the Paris Natural History Museum, where, as chance would have it, Buffon would have spent much of his time. Another visitor called Christopher Gist stopped by in March 1750 and described seeing the teeth of a large beast that looked like fine ivory when the outside was scraped off. There's also a history of bad luck at Big Bone Lick, at least back then and at least when it came to people trying to take fossils away. George Crone visited Big Bone Lick in May 1765 and took 2 6-foot tusks and several other fossil bones. But he lost all his belongings when he was attacked by Native Americans as he travelled home. Although he did manage to send some from a later expedition to Benjamin Franklin. Remember him? I told you he'd come up again. Now he sent them to Franklin as a gift. Now hold on to that thought, because that gift is going to come back in our story later on. Meanwhile, future President of the USA, William Henry Harrison, visited in 1795 and collected 13 good-sized barrels of fossils, which he tried to ship back with him on the Ohio River. However, he was not the first or the last to discover that fossils can be very heavy. As when his barge sank on the way home, all of his finds sank with it and were lost. Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark fame visited Big Bone Lick in late 1803 and retrieved a number of bones, all of which were lost or stolen. Jefferson's own collection of fossils was later ground up and turned into fertilizer by one of his servants. Possibly by accident, but the guy kept slaves, so if I were working for him for no pay and no chance of freedom ever, well, who knows. So what happened to those fossils that did make it out, the ones that were sent to Benjamin Franklin as a gift? Franklin was known then, and is still known now, as an eminent scientist and thinker of his day, connected to some of the foremost scientists of the time. He arranged for them to be studied by a guy called Peter Collinson, who thought they were elephants who had died in Noah's flood. It was pretty common at the time to link fossils to Bible stories and to try and use them as evidence of its teachings. Later on though, the idea came up that they might be from an extinct animal, when the same fossils were studied by another scientist called William Hunter, who specialised in anatomy. He suggested they were still a type of elephant, but an extinct carnivorous type of elephant. This was based on this massive tooth and the sharp ridge on the top. He deduced that this sharp ridge would have been better for cutting flesh than the obviously vegetation grinding flat teeth of elephants and even mammoths. This meat-loving elephant became known as the American incognitum, at least for a while, because our antagonist in this tale, Buffon, had other people and places on his list of grudges and enemies, not just the New World of America. For example, he hated his scientific colleague, the prominent naturalist Georges Cuvier. Cuvier was the world leader in the description of animals and plants that were new to Western science. So when you had a new creature to describe and understand, you sent it to Cuvier. And that's what happened with American incognitum. Cuvier studied them and declared that the fossils were not of an elephant, but, as Hunter had said, from an extinct elephant ancestor. He renamed it Mastodontes, and the name has stuck. Today, of course, we know it as the Mastodon. Extinction was a relatively radical concept at the time, with most Western scientists and people thinking that the life we see around us in the world today was life that had been created by God and saved by Noah on his ark, and that fossils were often interpreted as the animals that hadn't made it onto the ark. In other words, fossils were the same as animals today, but these ones hadn't managed to escape the flood. So back to this insult from Buffon. What should Jefferson do? He knew that the fossils were on their way, but what else could he do to persuade Buffon? Then he got it. A moose. Bull moose are famously large mammals found in North America to this day, and Jefferson is recorded as saying, "A European deer could walk under the belly of one of our bull moose." Just the sort of giant that Jefferson needed to show Buffon that the animals of America did not shrink in a wasteland. So Jefferson did what any leader of the time might. He sent 20 soldiers off into the woods to shoot a 7-foot tall moose, bring it to him so he could have it stuffed and sent on to Buffon. Now somewhere during this whole process, Jefferson claimed that he'd heard from Buffon that Buffon was persuaded that in fact it wasn't a wasteland in America and he was going to update his future book. I've looked for evidence of this, I can't find it, but maybe it happened. However, I think this is the beginning of a more important story about science in America over the subsequent 2 centuries. So why does all of this matter at all? Well, Jefferson didn't stop his fossil arms race there. The Mastodon was just the beginning. Jefferson personally went on to describe a set of massive 9-inch claws found in a Virginia cave, despite just having become the vice president at the time. He named this new creature Megalonyx, the Great Claw. Now Jefferson took the idea of giant animals in the New World really to heart, and his next step was to move it to a whole new level. I said we'd come back to Lewis and Clark. Well, they're best known for an expedition across the continent of North America. Now, it's safe to say that the places they were discovering had already got people living on them, people who'd been there for thousands of years, but that didn't seem to bother them. Now, Jefferson was a man of strong beliefs, And you know that new idea of extinction I mentioned earlier on? Yeah, he didn't believe in it. He personally tutored Lewis on mapping, botany, mineralogy, astronomy and navigation, and of course on paleontology and natural history. He expected them on their expedition to find mastodons and megalonyx still roaming in the wild alongside giant lions, and he wanted Lewis and Clark to find them and bring some home. While most presidents were worried about taxes and treaties, which I'm sure Jefferson thought about too, he had the East Room of the White House converted so he had all his fossils laid out. And he started to use deep time to shape a new identity for this new nation. That natural national identity persisted and perhaps in part led to future spectacular finds in North America. Perhaps this fossil war of Jefferson's laid the groundwork for the American paleontology that's come ever since. From the discovery of the first nearly complete dinosaur in the world, Hadrosaurus, in New Jersey decades later, to the bone wars of the mid-1800s and the more recent famous finds in the USA like Sue the T-Rex and Apex the Stegosaurus. It's a fascination with nature that I think exists in all of us and that certainly inspires paleontology and biology work across North America to this day. Now, if you're inspired by natural history and the natural world and want to learn more about geology, paleontology, and the stories that bring them to life, then please like and subscribe.